Hi, Glenys.
Hey, Aaron. What do you want to talk about today?
How much I hate diets.
Yeah, diets suck.
So what do you do instead of a diet?
Intuitive eating, health at every size.
So how many times have you had to explain intuitive eating and health at every size to someone?
Like 5,000 times. But that was just to my doctor.
Okay, so how many times have you explained it to someone and then they said, but diets are the only thing I know?
That's like every time. Can we pursue health without thinking about weight?
Yes, we can pursue health without thinking about weight.
That's pretty revolutionary, what you just said. But what if you just don't like yourself at the size that you're at?
I think we need to understand why, instead of just saying I need to change.
So, what's the deal with body positivity?
Oh man, that's a long answer. I'm Aaron Flores.
And I'm Glenys Oyston. And we are Dietitians Unplugged.
Hey everybody, welcome back for another episode of Dietitians Unplugged. How are you, Glenys?
Doing okay. But
can I say?
Yeah.
I hate that I keep asking that question. We're recording this in the end of April. We're still in the midst of our shelter in place. I feel like the question, how's it going, is really asinine. So
maybe.
Let
me tell you, because the answer is it's going nowhere. I'm stuck here all the time.
It's not going.
I don't feel so great about it. Yeah. So there we go. Getting real.
Man.
But I am excited about this episode. This has been like a shining light during this time.
Yeah.
To get to talk to just one of our favorite people.
Yeah, absolutely. And before we get to we announce who it is and read the bio, just, how are you doing, Glenys? Like, how are you hanging in there through all of this?
It's been emotionally touch and go, I have to say.
Yeah.
I have now settled into the apathy that I think is required to, hang in through this. I'll be honest, like a month ago, I was actually really worried about whether I would still be in business in 6 months. As people are affected financially by this, they can't, this is some of the work that has to go, right? Like they're like, I can't afford to do this right now. And so unfortunately I had to press pause on some clients and, I really miss them and I hope they'll come back when things get better. But, that was a very scary moment to think hey, I might be losing my business in 6 months. I laugh nervously about it. I'm not actually feeling good about that at all. However, I feel reassured now that actually I probably will be okay. Very lucky. I feel very fortunate. And but it's been difficult. And during this episode, we did talk a little bit about feelings and body sensations, stuff related to that. So I won't get too into it now. But how are you really doing?
Like you, it depends on the day. I'm having a hard time in a lot of ways, and I'm having a lot of good moments as well. Thankfully everyone here in my house is safe and we're getting along and we're comfortable and we have food and we have air conditioning and we're all good. I think the hardest part that, just running into is, still it's a really scary world out there with this pandemic and, not quite sure what the future is going to hold. And, I'm still, well, I think appropriately, not over exaggerating, right? But I'm still worried. I'm still scared, and learning to also sit with those feelings. And so, doing interviews like this, talking to friends, talking to my family, talking to people is really helpful. My therapist loves me right now because I'm so fun to work with and bringing so much stuff to each session.
Mm-hmm.
But no, I mean, I'm finding it's really important for me to connect with people on a regular basis, and that's keeping me going.
Yeah, and this episode I felt like was a little bit of free therapy for us in a way. And I think actually all our listeners will also find this to be a very helpful and comforting episode.
Yeah.
Where our guest, who's Fiona Sutherland, a dietitian from Australia, someone we know pretty well, kind of talks about all the stuff that somebody could be experiencing right now, just like you and I are kind of feeling it.
Yeah. And I will say I've gotten some great feedback from people who have just found our show during this shelter in place order. And they've been, I've gotten a couple people say like, I've listened to like 7 episodes in the past 2 days, and it's great. So I think it's nice to know that this work that you and I are doing is also helpful in some way to people.
Yeah, that feels very gratifying. And hi, new listeners, welcome. We're so happy you're joining us, and we hope that you will enjoy this episode too, which I think you will.
For sure.
Let me introduce Fiona.
Yeah.
Who we talk about how we met in the episode, so I won't get into that. But Fiona is the director of the Mindful Dietitian and lives in Melbourne, Australia. Fiona is a committed health at every size and non-diet dietitian, and is specifically most passionate about supporting and educating health professionals to develop skills and insight into working with clients from a body-inclusive lens. She is the host of the podcast, The Mindful Dietitian, and teaches across Masters Level Dietetic training programs at several universities in Melbourne, specifically in counseling, skills, and weight-inclusive approaches in dietetics. Fiona is a dedicated mindfulness practitioner and yoga teacher, bringing a particular emphasis on embodiment, mindful eating, and body image into her work and training. She is a great lover of ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy, and trauma-informed approaches to dietetic work. And I would say I've been so lucky to be in one of Fiona's trainings, the one she did with Marcy Evans a few years ago on for professionals, body image training. And during that training, she also did a yoga practice with a bunch of us, and it was pretty amazing. Like if you're afraid of yoga and you can do a class with Fiona, it's like, oh, this isn't so bad. This is actually okay. She's just like the kindest, just really most supportive person you could be around. And so that's why this episode makes me so happy.
Absolutely. So without further ado, let's dive into our interview with Fiona Sutherland.
Fiona, so excited to finally have you here talking to us.
Glenys and Aaron, hello you two. What a pleasure.
We miss you so much.
Seriously.
Oh my goodness. I miss you and all of our crew incredibly, and more so now because this year has not turned out necessarily the way we expected. So yes, I am missing everybody terribly at the moment.
Yeah.
So just to give a little context to that, to why we miss each other so much, we met, we've known each other through social media, but we met at a conference back in, I think, 2016, maybe.
Yep.
And it was really infamous for this amazing elevator picture that we got with like everyone in the Haze community that you would ever imagine stuffing on an elevator. And so now it seems like every conference I go to, like how many, it sort of becomes the running joke of how many Haze folks can we get on in a selfie in an elevator. So
yes. There's a lot of them out there now, a lot of individual and collective photos out there. It's fantastic.
Yeah, and the entire eating disorder community was supposed to be gathering in Australia in the next few days, because this will be, this will be released in June for a huge conference, and unfortunately, obviously, we won't be there. And so I know that you've been looking forward to that for quite some time.
Yeah, we have been. The joint conference, it was going to be held by the Academy of Eating Disorders and the Australian New Zealand Academy of Eating Disorders, and I'm quite involved in the Australia New Zealand one. Not so much on the organising committee, but more on the executive, the kind of the decision-making leadership team, I guess you would say. It's very handy, by the way, to have health at every size eating disorder clinicians on that team. Very handy indeed, she says, wringing her hands. And so really this conference was going to be one out of the box in lots of ways, because the number of workshops and papers that were going to be presented by our, Hays crew, or people, that are doing very Hays aligned work in eating disorders, it was the first time that really there was a ton of sessions that we were able to go to. You were literally able to kind of go from one session to another and not hear a single O word, or not be exposed to a lot of fat phobia, for example, which is rife in eating disorder circles. So it was going to be just one of those events where you just got to hang out and, pretend you were cool with other really cool people. So
I love hanging out and pretending I'm cool. That's like the best thing.
Too. It's my favorite.
I mean, the moral of the story is, if you need to conference with anyone, it should be Fiona.
Yes.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I don't know what my actual conference motto is, but it has to include lots of fun. That's for sure.
For sure.
I think it should involve sneaking back into the conference area in the evening when nobody's there and playing with all the toys.
Oh my gosh, Glenys, yes, that's right.
I've just outed us.
Which totally never happened at Beta 2016. It never happened.
I made that up. So
yeah, you definitely made that up.
You're just talking in a very hypothetical sense. Like,
yes,
oh, wow,
absolutely.
That could be really cool.
That would be the most fun thing ever if it had
For
happened.
example, right.
And it didn't.
Exactly.
So as everybody can tell, like, you're just one of our favorite people of all time, and so much fun to hang out with. But we know you well. We want our listeners to know how you came to this work and what your Hays journey was like, just to start.
Yeah, thank you so much for asking, Glenys. So for those of you who don't know me, my professional background, I guess, is as a dietitian. And that's usually a good conversation stopper, or one which, heads off in a direction that really we don't necessarily enjoy, as you both will completely understand. But look, in summary, I guess I've come from a background, a family background where dieting was very prevalent in my family, and where bodies were spoken about in particular ways. So smaller women's bodies were spoken about in very praising kind of ways, and larger bodies were not, and were openly kind of vilified, I guess, so spoken about in quite a negative way.
How unusual.
I know, how unusual, right? Especially in the 70s and 80s. Hello,
right. Yeah,
entry diet culture.
Yeah.
So, that was it's really interesting, actually, because I've spent many hours in supervision, kind of really unpacking some of the reasons why I find myself here, because I don't have a personal experience of dieting and or a clinical eating disorder. And I think, some of that is because I was protected growing up in a smaller body. However, the messages around bodies most definitely influenced the way that then I grew up viewing bodies. I didn't question, the messages that were so prevalent in my own family. And, growing up, I definitely did equate, quote unquote, health with body size, just mainly because I didn't have anything else, having any other messages to balance that out with. I didn't have anybody else helping me to interrogate my own biases or bringing into question, all these messages that I had so very neatly tucked away inside my little brain. Through my university years, I did an undergraduate degree in science at Melbourne University here in my hometown, and my home city, I should say. And I was heading more towards medicine or physiotherapy, or physical therapy, as you call it in the US. And by third year, I had made very good friends with, another woman at university, and all she wanted to do was be a dietitian. She'd always wanted to be a dietitian, and I'd never thought about this as a career path. So long story short, I did apply for the Masters in Nutrition and Dietetics, and I got into that course, which is some kind of a miracle, because basically my first 2 years of my 3-year undergrad were not spent at university, but rather spent at local drinking establishments. So and I'm sure nobody relates to that.
No one.
So However, by the time I got to my master's degree and I was paying a shit ton of money for that, I was like, I suppose I'd better do this thing called studying, concentrating, focusing, not talking, being in class, etc., etc. So, I was not a great dietetic student at all. I didn't take really much seriously, but what it did teach me is, about what was very wrong in the way that we, spoke about food and eating and people's bodies. And oh my goodness, just so much of the stuff now that I question, I think to myself, ugh, that our training back then in the early 2000s had a lot left to be desired. That's for sure. But I went to the UK. I worked in clinical practice for 2 years in a hospital. Hated it. Really, 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 really hated it. But I was earning good money, got to travel through Europe, et cetera, et cetera. That was a really fun time. I got back familiar with the drinking establishments, et cetera. It's what I trained to do. And then I actually became really quite disillusioned with my profession and moved then to Canada for 2 years, as you know, Glenys, being a Canadian. And I worked with young people in the Rocky Mountains in Alberta, just between Calgary and Banff. And that was the time when I did not miss being a dietitian. I didn't think I would ever go back to the profession, but that was a time when I worked with people from all walks of life, from all backgrounds, from many different backgrounds, and learned a lot about Indigenous peoples of Canada. And, I was just exposed to a lot of experiences that I hadn't previously had. And that was really formative in me understanding myself more than anything else. Because before then I was like school, university, more university, part-time work, friends. My life was very, I hadn't really been exposed to any particular major difficulty. Life had been pretty smooth, but my time in Canada really exposed me to some of my own personal difficulties, and also the significant difficulties of other people. I think that was just really formative for where I find myself now. So after that, I came back to Australia. Once my visa ran out, I was like sucking that visa dry, believe me. I just wanted to stay. And then I found myself coming back to Melbourne. And the truth is I just needed a job. My backup career was barista, as it still is. I'm sure we all have our backup careers. I know that Dana Sturtevant's is at florist. And my backup career is, when anybody... when I get sick of telling people I'm a dietitian, then I just say I'm a barista, and that seems to lead in a much more interesting direction, if I'm honest.
I just feel like being a barista is so much harder than what I do, actually.
Yeah.
I just want to be honest. When I go into Starbucks and I see people like that, the way that well-oiled machine works, I just get like so anxious. I'm like, just give me my fancy drink and walk out. Like, so shout out to baristas. Like, that seems like some hard shit to do.
Yeah.
But yeah, I appreciate that you feel competent that you could move into that eventually.
Yeah. And mine is working a haberdashery.
Oh. So tell us more about that.
Is that hats? No, that's the milliners. What's a haberdashery?
Yeah, no, haberdashery, hats. Chapeau. A chapeau shop. And just helping people find the right size hats.
Yeah.
You guys, I'm really scared. I don't have a backup career. This is like it.
Oh, Glenys, what are you doing with your life?
So by the way, for anyone who thinks that I'm serious, I'm not. This is like a total reference to Spinal Tap. There's a scene near the end where Nigel Tufnell is one of the characters, who's played by Christopher Guest, saying like, it'd be nice to work in a haberdashery, Like,
Glenys and I totally missed it. We were like, really?
Deep cuts.
Listen, there's probably two people listening to this podcast who probably knew that was a reference to Spinal Tap.
Yeah.
I had to give it up.
Thank you for explaining. It's literally I'm the only person who watched Spinal Tap and thinks everybody's impersonations of it are funnier. Anyway, but we digress. We seriously digress. Sure. I don't have a backup career. Aaron's going to be in a haberdashery. Fiona's going to be a barista. But it turns out you didn't have to do that.
Well, it turns out I didn't, because Yeah, thank goodness. Yeah, because I mean, I'm okay with our home coffee machine, but get me in a public cafe setting, and I think I'll panic. I'm like,
Yeah,
"Ugh, what do I need to do with the milk and the temperature?" And everybody's got 10 items in the order. It's not just
exactly.
give me a flat white.
Yep.
Fancy. All right. So where was I? Okay. So came back to Australia, and you know what the truth is? I just needed a job. I needed a job to not only pay my bills, but then pay off my credit card from traveling, and my studying expenses, my loans, etc., etc. So just needed a job, and as as fortune would have it, being a dietitian actually pays more than being a barista. Marginally, mind you, but
Marginally.
marginally. My God. So anyway, I thought to myself, well, actually, I sat down with my dad, who is no longer with us, sadly, but he was a man who didn't necessarily have a lot of very, very strong opinions, except when he did, kind of thing. And so he sat me down and he's like, "So you're not going to be a dietitian anymore?" Right. How's that going to go for you? I was like, all right. Okay. Message received. So, God, this always makes me just feel a bit sick in my stomach because, as you two know this about me, so I actually took a job in a weight loss clinic, and you know where this is heading, and I'm sure a lot of your listeners know where this is heading, because I didn't think anything of it at the time. I know that Glenys, you worked in your earlier career working at the VA and working in more weight centric
Yeah, I was lucky though.
things.
I never had to push that. But before I became a dietitian, and I cringe when I say this, but I worked for Weight Watchers twice.
That's right, you did, yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So we've all done our time with the enemy.
Yeah, and I ran a weight
No.
loss program for the VA.
That's right, you did.
Mhm.
Yes.
So
We've all done
I
our
feel
time.
your shame. I feel your shame.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
you don't know what you don't know, right?
Well, no. I look back now, and at first at first when all this kind of when it came to light that I'd actually been actively harming people, or participating in harming people, I should say, unintentionally, of course. I did kind of feel very embarrassed, very ashamed. And whereas now I can view that time in my life, which is what I'm sure we're going to get to today. It's a lot thanks to mindfulness, really. I'm able to be a lot more open minded and a lot more open hearted about my own experiences and what I did and didn't know, and just find some space there for some understanding and compassion and, just being able to give myself a little bit of grace with what I was not aware of, which is interestingly why I'm so passionate about education and training, because it was only through coming across non-diet approach in the early 2000s that I really started to the pieces of the puzzle started to kind of fit together, because obviously what happened in this job is that I saw a ton of people just really suffering. At first, I was seeing them suffering because they were, in body hating hell, and suffering because they were trying to control their food and their eating and their body shape and size. So that was kind of creating suffering. And then 6 months down the track, or 3 to 6 to 12 months down the track, there was more suffering when they felt like the work that we had done together had ostensibly failed. So what I was viewing, unfortunately, in very real time with very real humans, was diet cycling and diet failure. Which I had not been part of my training. I really didn't understand it any more than a very rudimentary fashion. And interestingly, I didn't blame my clients, and I didn't blame dieting because I didn't know that was where it was. Actually, interestingly, I blamed myself. I thought that I was doing a really bad job as a dietitian, and for the second time, well, second of multiple times as it would turn out, I was like, that's it, I'm out of here, close the door, press exit. I'm obviously shit at doing this thing that I'm meant to be able to do. And that is to help people change their bodies and change their behaviors. And now looking back, I just think, oh, you poor thing. Like, whoopsie.
Mm-hmm.
So at the same time, that was part-time. I then accepted a job in eating disorders and also in sports nutrition. So I kind of was dancing around three different positions. And unsurprisingly, there was a lot of commonalities that I noticed in people really struggling with eating disorders, my chronic dieting, kind of desperate to lose weight people, and then the athletes, the very high performance elite athletes that I was working with. And so I saw this kind of commonality. And so I started to really deeply question, what am I doing to help? Like, how do I even define quote unquote helping in these groups of people that I'm working with here? And I started to ask myself things like, why was I doing different things for different groups of people with such similar experiences? Why was I okay with doing one thing with one group of people and then naming it as disordered with another group of people, and then naming it as, just part of being an athlete with another group of people? And I was like, well, hang on a second, there's something very, very wrong here. And I think it was around that time that I was like, oh, maybe it's not me. There's something actually wrong here and I didn't know what to name it. I had no foundations of understanding what this was that I was noticing. So it was a real, almost an existential crisis. I've got to say, it was not only a career crisis, but then an existential crisis. And I think a lot of us relate to that point where we're like, oh, we're noticing all this stuff, but I certainly didn't have a name for it at that point in time. So I know you two relate to that. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
Oh, yeah.
100%.
Mm-hmm.
So it was at that time I stumbled fortuitously across the non-diet approach, which came to me in the form of a book by a Melbourne-based GP by the name of Dr. Rick Korsman, who wrote the book If Not Dieting, Then What? And look, at the time in the early 2000s, it was really, the non-diet approach was really about addressing diet mentality and dieting behaviors, eating more widely and listening to appetite. Really, if I was to summarize it back then, that was what it was. And, I'd still see some remnants of that these days. And, now we understand more through the lens of body inclusivity and trauma-informed approaches, that there's so much more to what we're doing, in body, in healing relationships, whether that's with body, with food, with our own experiences. But at the time, this was my first step. So it's so I do have a lot of compassion for people for whom that's their first step too. So at the time, it was interesting. It felt really exciting, but it also felt very dangerous. Like if I look back, I felt like I was being really naughty. I'm being really edgy, and now I'm like, that's not edgy. But at the time, it felt very edgy. And it was certainly many years before not many, maybe 5 years before I found myself in supervision where I should have been all the freaking time. And certainly a few years before I took a much more deeply introspective approach. Where did I position myself amongst this whole mess? How did my privilege, really, understanding the privileges that I bring, that I live with and bring to the world, and how does this inform the way I understand myself and others and the world? When it comes to then health at every size, which was kind of the next step, I can't remember exactly when I first heard those words. But it definitely for me provided some of those crucial missing pieces, and importantly, infused some rage into my practice. So, I'm a big believer in rage and anger and in big emotions. So I think that was where I started to broaden the lens in terms of, more understanding things through a justice-oriented lens, and understanding health at every size from that way. So, yeah, I think,
Wow.
fast forward, whatever it is, 10, 15 years. Yeah, 15 years probably. So I now find myself, I'm still an eating disorder dietitian, a specialist, I guess you would say. But, the core of my work now is supervision and education and training of student dietitians and graduate dietitians as well. So that's what I love, love, love to do the most. And of course, we do what we wish we had done, right? So
Yeah.
here we are.
Yeah, that's amazing.
And I think, I for the other professionals who are out there, I think, who listen to the show, I think, how you emphasize supervision is so important because, at least here in the States, I don't feel like our profession does a very good job about promoting supervision or making space that you should be getting supervision. It's more like, oh, you got it. Let's take some CEUs every now and then and keep up your accreditation, but there's no like formal supervision process. And I just love how you sort of talk about the importance of that and getting that from day one, because, we, all of us come into this work with so much, like pride and hubris, right? That it can get in the way pretty darn quickly. So thank you for bringing that up. I think that's a great point.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I'm very, very passionate about supervision,
Yeah.
and mainly because of the experiences I had in supervision were so formative in terms of me being able to come in closer contact with my own experiences and how that influenced the way that I showed up for other people. Had I not had supervision, or if I had not taken it so, I guess, seriously, if that makes sense, then I definitely would not be where I am now. Because of course I'm very evolved as a human.
Of course
I'm not at all.
Well, and listen, we can't have a podcast right now. We're recording this in the end of April. We can't have a podcast without talking about COVID-19 and the struggles that we're all experiencing as a world. One of the things that we see, amongst just our friends, our family, and we hear about is how many people are feeling like an increase in their disordered eating or eating disorders right now. And so I think we'd be curious to hear, how does mindfulness come into play in a time like this? And is there like a body healing potential with mindfulness as we move through this experience of COVID?
Yeah, gosh, such great questions. Thank you, Aaron. So I guess my own history with mindfulness was very gradual. And when I think back, some of my earlier exposure to it was through my own involvement in sport. So that was more, I didn't name it as mindfulness, but if I think back to it, that state of flow or state of calm was really, for me, experienced through my own kind of involvement in sport. But in terms of my professional involvement, I started taking mindfulness a lot more seriously when I started studying ACT, which is acceptance and commitment therapy. So I did that training, level 1 and level 2, about 12 years ago now. And at the time, I came to a realization, quite suddenly, mind you, which was a bit confronting, that I didn't know my own mind very well. And, confronting is the right word, because by this stage I'd already been and working with people's minds and bodies, I guess, ostensibly for about 5 years. And in ACT, being able to notice our experiences and becoming more familiar with our experiences. So by experiences, what I'm talking about is thoughts, feelings, sensations, perceptions, and all the activities that go on inside of us and outside of us. So it's a really key. Noticing our experiences is really key to being to becoming aware of how we work with our own thoughts and feelings, etc. So mindfulness then, as one of the key processes of acceptance and commitment therapy, was my kind of first intro. So I'm just going to pull up the bus here just for a moment, Aaron and Glenys, if it feels okay, because I'm wondering if it might be helpful to let people know a little bit about what mindfulness is and maybe what it isn't. Would that feel helpful?
Yes.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. Well, the reason I kind of park in the bus is because, unfortunately, as we have all observed, a lot of the wisdom traditions feels really lost in more modern iterations of mindfulness, and particularly when it's being co-opted by, I don't know, privileged white people with something to sell, right?
Yeah.
So, I think it's probably worthwhile us just parking things here for a second. So my favorite definition of mindfulness is that of Jon Kabat-Zinn, who he's written a lot of books, but my favourite is one called Full Catastrophe Living. And this kind of became the basis of his 8-week program called Mindfulness-Based Stress Reduction, which has been replicated in, many, many different languages, many different countries throughout the world, and is available to anyone. Really, it is available at no cost, low cost, and full fee for people whom that can be accessible. So, its shorthand is called MBSR, and it's really widely available throughout the world. So, I really encourage people to take a look at that. It's an amazing kind of entry point into mindfulness. But Jon Kabat-Zinn defines mindfulness in 4 quite specific ways. So, paying attention on purpose, in the present moment, and non-judgmentally. So what this definition really invites us to consider is that our experiences, in other words, thoughts, feelings, sensations, and perceptions, that we can consider them in a very particular way. So in other words, with a sense of curiosity, a sense of openness, and a willingness to feel all the things. So things like pain, joy, and everything in between. So what mindfulness is it's not manipulating our experiences. So we kind of only get the quote unquote good ones, the ones that feel good. It's not about that. Or it's also not about sitting for hours upon hours in silence on a meditation cushion. That's also not really what mindfulness, it's one part of what mindfulness could be for some people in some situations, right? So mindfulness is not about manipulating or changing. It's about being with rather than doing to. So overall, it's an invitation to get to know ourselves better and to get to know our experiences better, but with the overt and explicit idea that we get to know all of ourselves, all of our experiences. So we're not just doing this pick a box type thing. It's like, oh, hello, joy. Hello, happiness. Hello, calm. I like you. Oh, I'll take you. Oh, but sadness, anger, grief, loss, disappointment. Ugh, no thanks. I'll just leave you. So what mindfulness is an invitation really to really gently and with compassion and with curiosity invites us to look at the full range, the full spectrum of our human experiences, which, I mean, as I'm sure that for people listening, it's like, oh, what? You mean it's not just the good ones? Nope, it's not. So this is what is really hard about mindfulness. Actually, I found it the hardest is it's like when we feel good things or when we have pleasant thoughts, we want to hang on to those, right? We kind of tend to attach to those things. And then we tend to reject those experiences in ourselves that are really icky, really yucky, and really uncomfortable. But this is, the point of mindfulness, I guess, is to become more familiar, in summary, more familiar with our experiences, the kind of the quote unquote, the good, the bad, and everything in between, so that we're able to do 2 key things. The first is noticing our thoughts and feelings and sensations just as they are, without manipulating, without changing, without forcing, without avoiding, without attaching. And number 2, the second is that we develop a sense of I would describe it as like a sense of space or a pause. So we're noticing, pausing, and the point of that is so we can respond rather than react. So a lot of my own personal experiences, I'm sure your personal experiences and our clients' experiences, is that we can become very, very reactive to our own, to what we pick up in our bodies, to sensations, to thoughts. We can become very angry, very upset or frustrated at ourselves when we appear to be doing the same thing again and again. And we can say, I know what I'm doing. I can see what I'm doing. I just can't seem to do it differently, right? A lot of people who experience disordered eating and chronic dieting or just a poor relationship with food and eating and their bodies really relate to this. It's like, I know what I need to be doing differently. I just can't do it. So what mindfulness really helps us to do is it's not a magic elixir. It is not a magic wand, but what it does do is it's an invitation to become more familiar with our reactive selves and gives us actually really important skills to become more responsive rather than reactive. And that can only be done with noticing and pausing, which is actually literally only a few seconds, really. I'm talking about it as if it's like weeks and days, but it's not. It's actually literally a few seconds. So is it worthwhile, Aaron, kind of now talking about how this is related to current events?
Yeah, no, totally. Because listen, just from my own experience, right? My emotions and feelings and thought processes can change within the hour.
Yes.
Right now. So no, I think it's a great place to sort of bring context to that.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I really, really relate to that. I know that during the week, one of our colleagues, actually a good common friend of ours, put up a post on Facebook saying, you know, where along the stages of grief are you? And she posted a picture of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's stages of grief. And for those of you who are not familiar with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, it's incredibly relevant for now. What we are experiencing now is a collective grief, really. And I would point people to a really amazing article that was in Harvard Business Review last month, an interview with a psychologist by the name of David Kessler, who co-wrote on grief and grieving with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. And he has a new book out, which is called Finding Meaning. And he postulates that finding meaning is the sixth stage of grief. I'm only about 5 chapters in, but I really, really recommend it because right now, in the loss and in the very big emotions, I guess you would say, and the big feelings, this is, we could name this as a form of grief. So, right now with current events, and we might, we might name this as a time of real stress for a lot of people. I've become a little bit uneasy with this, the catch cry of quote unquote, we're all in this together. Because although I see this personally, I see this as definitely a collective experience, we can't ignore that what's happening at the moment influences and impacts people in so many different ways. And, that has definitely got something to do with power and privilege and systems of oppression. So, although it's a collective experience, I just want to pause and just give a hat tip that this is not, we're not experiencing this the same way. So in terms of current events, it would come as no surprise that people are experiencing lots of emotions and also lots of emotions that relate to maybe the way in which we use food. So disordered eating, I'm noticing it becoming more, I guess, obvious. People becoming kind of really clamping down on food and eating and, a lot of fat phobia, a lot of fear of weight gain, et cetera, which is so harmful to so many people, not only the people that are actually enacting it, but then also people who are reading it and who have experienced a lot of, stigmatization in our culture. So, as humans, we're just looking to feel safe and secure. That's all really that we're looking for. So, this current time is anything but safe and secure. It's like the opposite to safe and secure. And food is really effective. Like it is super effective at soothing and comforting. Really effective. And I know that you both on Dietitians Unplugged talk a lot about normalizing and destigmatizing our food-related responses. There are some really powerful ways that we can utilize mindfulness skills now, both from a broader perspective with this kind of chronically stressed state that we are collectively finding ourselves in, but then also maybe how we might specifically use this around food. So would it be helpful for us to kind of talk about that more specifically, is how we might understand how we could utilize mindfulness at the moment. Would that be helpful?
Yes.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, cool. All right. Let me think. Where do we start? All right. Is
Fiona,
it okay if
I just want to say,
yes.
I love that you ask, is it okay if we do this? I'm like, Fiona, whatever you want to talk about is awesome.
And would it be awesome if we just say no? Nah, fuck this. Let's move on
No,
to something
we
else.
don't want to talk about that. Screw
Shut
you.
up. Yes.
Go back to the pub drinking. Let's go back to the pub drinking part.
But this is
Exactly.
how, I mean, I think being in session with you is probably amazing, where you're like, is it okay if we talk about this? And I love that you do that. So, hey, everybody, we're just going to pause here. This conversation was so juicy with Fiona that we decided to just keep it going. And we're going to do a part 2 and release it in a couple of weeks for you to hear the rest of it. So tune in a couple of weeks. Just stay alert to your to the subscription alerts, and we hear the rest of this, and we get really deep into our discussion around trauma and mindfulness and all sorts of good stuff.